Hi everybody, Ali at My Safe Place here. Thanks for tuning in. I've had a few emails and comments on some of my videos, which has been really wonderful. Thank you. And they've asked a couple of questions or mentioned some of the connections that they sort of felt between our stories. So I wanted to talk first about the question I received, which was, how did I go no contact with my mother? And it's a pretty simple story. So one of the things that I want to mention before going into it is that I had been seeing a therapist on and off over the years for things like postpartum depression, which I suffered after the birth of my daughter, who was my second child. And I saw the same therapist when I was going through cancer treatment to sort of help me talk through that, as well as the divorce and some other issues that came up. So this was someone that I had already developed a very good rapport with and that I really trusted, and someone who knew me, although there were long gaps in between seeing her. I think the longest was 7 years. She was still able to remember and catch up with things. So I want to underline how important I think it is, certainly it was for me, to have someone that I trusted, that I could talk through these very difficult issues with. And they'd obviously come up in the past, but never as big as they had this time. And one of the things I had been seeing her for was how to improve my relationship with my mother and my sister, both of whom she believed, of course she can't make an official diagnosis without someone sitting in the room, but she believed to be suffering from cluster B personality disorders. Sounded a lot like borderline personality disorder with my sister, and with my mother it sounded like possibly a malignant borderline or narcissistic personality disorder. Not quite sure. And one of the things that we had been discussing is how I could change my reactions and my feelings and my behavior towards them in an effort to elicit different responses from them. Because as relationship experts will often tell you, you can't change anyone else. The only person you can really change is yourself. So do the work on yourself and you might find that the relationship changes. So I committed to that. I worked pretty hard at it. I was really interested in having this relationship improve, especially after my father had passed away. And geographical distance between family of origin and where I live now with my children and my second husband made it important that any time that we did spend together when we were visiting, that it be high quality as much as possible. And the more work I did on myself, interestingly enough, the more I was able to realize that essentially there's only so much I could do in this particular situation. There was only so much that I could affect because of who they are. And this is probably true for everybody. And this is where it becomes important to understand that if you've done your best, like I really felt like I'd done my best and I was working towards my best, and certainly no contact was not even an option in my mind at the time that it happened. And this is what's so interesting. I had started by putting up a boundary with my sister and told my mother about it, explained to her that if my sister continued along her current track, I was going to be removing myself from any contact with my sister. And I had warned her about this in person. I'd warned my mother about this in person. And my mother had not replied at that time. And then over a holiday weekend, several months later, my mother insisted that I speak to my sister. And I said, no, I'm not going to speak to her. I already explained to you she's crossed that line, and I'm not going to be having any more contact with her at the moment. And my mother refused to honor that. She called me back a few days later and insisted on forcing my sister down my throat, essentially. So what I did about that was react. I got very reactionary. This was not a measured reply on my behalf. I became very agitated at her refusal to see and understand what I was feeling. And what I understand now is that she was gaslighting. I didn't know that at the time. I do now. I understand she was gaslighting me and pretending that my sister hadn't done anything to cause problems. So in my reaction, I got very, very upset and I yelled at her, "I'm not having this conversation with you anymore." And I hung up on her. And then pretty much immediately afterwards made an appointment with my therapist to go talk about what had just happened, because this was the exact opposite of everything that I had been working towards in terms of changing my own reactions and behaviors in order to improve the relationship. And what I discovered when I met with my therapist was that indeed I was probably hitting that last straw moment. Even though I hadn't been thinking it was there, I hadn't been gearing up towards it, unlike with my sister where I had sort of set a limit. I hadn't set that same limit with my mother. So as surprising as it was to me, it was not surprising to my therapist that I'd come to this conclusion. And she helped me work through and work out a list, and I've discussed this in another video, making a list and checking it once, twice, ... where I went through a list of all of the things that she had said or done that hurt me, and the list was considerable. And we discussed what the difficulties and implications of going no contact with my mother and my sister would be, especially since I was still in contact with my younger brother, who has 2 small children with whom I wanted to maintain some form of relationship. I don't feel like children should have to suffer the loss of family members because some of us don't get along. And I also felt like my children were old enough at the time to make their own decisions about staying in contact with their grandmother and their aunt if they so chose. So from there, I decided that I was going to go no contact with my mother. And I didn't get any contact from my mother for 3 or 4 months, which had been the pattern before. Anytime we'd had a disagreement, my mother would stop talking to me. And then 3 or 4 months later, she'd call me up as though nothing had happened and no discussion would ever ensue about what had happened before. So this wasn't a surprise to me either, this decision, this 3 or 4 months without contact. And once again, she attempted to contact me by sending me a postcard from where she was, and being very flippant and not dealing with anything deep. And I didn't respond to that. And she sent me a few more letters. They were long letters that I did not read. I basically threw them out. I wouldn't even let my husband read them. So that's how no contact started, and it keeps going for me. Now I have the added ease of being geographically far away from her. It has made a situation with my brother and his children, his young children, very, very, very strained. And I'm considering possibly having to go no contact with him as well, although it would probably break my heart not to see or speak to my niece and nephew again. But that is the nature of this decision. No contact is a tough, tough decision. And it's not made just because I'm pissed off and don't want to have anything more to do with my family. It's starting to get into the level of self-care and understanding that I'm actually, if I'm going to be any sort of useful individual going forward, in whatever time I have left, I need to take care of me in order to be able to take care of my kids and my husband. And the trouble I find with going no contact with someone like a parent is that you don't get a lot of support from people who don't understand. It's almost as though everybody's telling you to stop talking or let it go or whatever to toxic people in your life. But when you mention that the toxic person is your mother or your father or your sister, all hell breaks loose. So this is again where I think it's really important for people to have a supportive third party, someone who understands the nature of abuse, trauma bonding, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, someone who really gets how hard this is, the fact that trauma bonds and PTSD indicate that there are physiological changes in your brain that make leaving the abuser incredibly difficult. So if I have a message for anybody who's contemplating no contact, is consider all the factors and go over it with someone who understands you and has compassion for you. And please, please, please don't continue to try to convince someone like a friend or another family member who doesn't understand what you're going through, who doesn't get how incredibly painful this is and difficult. And it's going to take years to recover, let's be honest. Don't try to convince those people that you're right to do what you're doing, because they probably won't get it. It makes no sense to them. If someone's had a really great relationship with their parents or come from a relatively loving home, what you're doing when you go no contact with an abusive parent or sibling or other family member is you're causing them a lot of distress because they don't understand where it is that you're coming from, even though they might be the very same people who were, if you were married to an abuser, would be like, why don't you just leave? And that's the conflict, is that you can say that about an abuser who happens to be a spouse or a partner, but you can't say it about an abusive parent or sibling, which is a hypocrisy. But you don't need to bring that up. You just need to understand it for yourself, that there are a lot of people who are not going to get you and who are going to think you're wrong for doing what you're doing and that you're the one causing all the pain, without understanding that in order for you to heal and for me to heal, we have to do this. And it means leaving a lot behind. It means leaving family members behind who may not understand where it is that you're coming from. It may mean leaving an inheritance behind that you need in your life, or other financial support that you might be getting from family. It might mean leaving the family business. It might mean having to move away. It might mean, if your children are still young, it might mean depriving them, quote unquote, of a relationship with close family members. So this is not a decision to be taken lightly. This is something tough, and it's hard, and you need support. So I encourage you to find someone who gets it. And there are lots of great therapists out there, psychologists, counselors, whatever, who don't get it, who are absolutely fantastic at all kinds of other things, but don't necessarily understand the nature of trauma bonding and complex PTSD. Now I'm going to leave a couple of links down below. I've been also really helped by some of the wonderful videos on YouTube, Self-Care Haven, as well as some other narcissistic abuse survivors who are putting out amazing videos with lots of great information, references to fantastic books, a couple of which I will leave down below. Shahida of Self-Care Haven has actually written a book called Becoming the Narcissist's Nightmare. I'll leave you a link to that. Pete Walker has written a book called Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, another fantastic resource. I'll leave you a link to a website that describes the symptoms of PTSD, complex PTSD, which is different from PTSD that we often hear soldiers or veterans suffering from. There are different symptoms and things that need specific healing and treatment modalities to manage. So I encourage you to keep going. I encourage you to know that you're not alone. There's lots of us out there who are working through this, and part of the reason I'm making these videos is to get this stuff out of me, because it's been completely repressed and denied for a very, very long time. And I need to acknowledge what's going on for me. And I want to encourage people to do the same in whatever. You don't have to make videos, but journal, talk to someone, really understand that there is a way to get better, a way to heal. And I wish you all the best, and thanks for watching.